Welcome to the Earth Feels podcast.
I'm Rose.
And I'm Christine.
Welcome to Earth Feels, the podcast for people feeling overwhelmed by the endlessly gloomy climate news.
Where every week we have soul-based conversations about climate change and explore the idea that climate change may be happening for us as much as it is happening to us.
If you are ready to shift your focus and secure the future for our kids and our grandkids, then this is the podcast for you.
And yes, we do know how to spell.
It's Rose here with Christine, and this week's episode is entitled, What's Your Climate Story? I've long believed that our stories are our greatest medicine, and telling your personal story, in my humble opinion, creates inclusivity. And I know that when I share my story, it allows you to share yours. And suddenly, neither of us is alone. We have developed a community. So recently I came across climatestoriesproject.org. And it's an educational, artistic forum for people from all walks to share their stories about the changing climate in their area and how it's affecting them. And it seems like a brilliantly simple way to get climate dialogue started. Today, we're thrilled to have with us Jason Davis, who is the director of Climate Stories Project. Jason is a musician, an environmental educator, and a leader of the environmental improv ensemble Earth Sound, which is very cool. I went in and listened to some of your stuff over the weekend. Jason began developing Climate Stories Project in 2014. Hope I'm getting kind of all of this right. And if I'm not, please feel free to challenge me. So welcome, Jason.
Hi, thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, we're thrilled to have you here. I'm just going to let you talk. Tell us a little bit about your climate story and what inspired you to start this project.
Sure. So yeah, I grew up around Boston. I've lived in Massachusetts most of my life. For me as a kid and as an adult, I was connected with the changing seasons, like the 4 seasons of New England, and something about the like kind of the drama of it. You know, you have big change from winter to spring. Everything's growing all of a sudden, and there's like this burst of life. And then in the summer, you have these big thunderstorms coming by, and it's like a drama, you know, and the change to fall and winter. So what I really connected with is the way that's been shifting. So, you know, as I've gotten older, I've observed, for example, in the summer, like the thunderstorms don't seem quite as dramatic anymore. It seems like the rain is kind of weaker, and then it can be really, really hot. And then instead of like having this big thunderstorm kind of wash away all that humidity, it just sort of stays humid for a long time. And sometimes you'll have like these 70-degree days in February, which I definitely didn't remember from when I was a kid. So
65-degree days this November. I've never remembered this.
Yeah, exactly. We just had a stretch of a week or 10 days of 70-degree weather in Massachusetts. And so, yeah, I mean, that's been my climate story. I guess that's what I've connected most strongly with for my own personal life. And that's, you know, people around the world are experiencing way more devastating impacts than just seasonal change, huge wildfires in California, massive flooding in Bangladesh, you know, so people are losing their livelihoods and their health and their safety because of climate change. So in a sense, I'm fortunate to live in an area that's been hit hard, but is not as severe as a lot of places in the world. So yeah, about the Climate Stories Project, it actually started as a music project, kind of strangely enough. So I was just looking for a way to express climate change using music. And there's been a lot of composers who've done that, but using like data. So say taking the past 100 years of global temperature data and assigning a data point of temperature to a pitch or to a rhythm. It's called data sonification. So you can actually compose a whole piece with this data, and you turn it into sound or music, and then you have a piece. Yeah, it's cool. It's cool. I mean, personally, I just find it a little bit like abstract. I think it can be really powerful depending on how you present it. But I've always connected with people's stories. When I was doing my master's degree, I was working in Costa Rica and doing a lot of interviewing with people about their connection to their local environment. And it just really struck how much connection I had with their stories. You know, like I really got to know people well and just heard about their love of their environment. And it really stayed with me. And so when I started thinking about climate change, it was that side of climate change which really got me, is like, how do we relate emotionally to the changing climate? What are we observing? I decided to take people's recorded narrative about climate change and use their voice within music, which wasn't a totally original idea, at least in this, at least the technique. There was a composer named Steve Reich who kind of pioneered this back in the 70s and 80s of using recorded voice samples and putting them into music. So I just heard some of his pieces and I was like, oh, this is super cool. And I thought something like this could be interesting in the context of climate stories.
When you get people's climate story, then you're adding music to all of them?
No, usually what I do is, so say I'll do an interview with someone about their climate story, then I'll record the interview. It could be half an hour long interview. Later, I'm obviously with the permission. So later I go through the interview and I pick out sections which I find really compelling. So for example, like when I was up in Alaska, in Shishmaref, Alaska in 2015, which is a little Inuit village on the Bering Sea. And it's really been ground zero for climate change. They've had huge erosion. They've lost a lot of the sea ice around the village. And so now you have these huge winter storms hitting the coastline just unimpeded. I got to work there with a high school class that were studying climate change. And then the students went into the village and talked to their elders about the changing climate. So they were discussing the sea ice, discussing how it's changed hunting and fishing and the water supply. And then I did a couple interviews while I was there, and one of them was with an elder named John Sinek. He talked about a lot of things, but the one that really stuck out to me was like how the sound of the snow has changed. Yeah, it was fascinating. So when he was a kid, he observed that like people walking in the snow, it sort of had a real dry, crunchy sound. But then as he's become older, he noticed like that sound is not the same anymore.
Wow.
So that's an example of a very specific image, which really stayed with me. And I knew I was going to have to use that in some musical pieces. And I ended up writing 2 pieces with that snippet from there. So it's like that. I'll just do some interviews, or I'll have people submit stories. And then I'll go through them and find parts that are really musically compelling. And then write music with those pieces, with those sections inside of it.
And so those pieces you can find on Earth Sound, is that correct?
Some of them, yeah. So Earth Sound was a jazz group I started in Boston in 2008. And that was originally just using recorded nature sounds. So like not people's dialogue, but like sounds of birds or ocean or thunderstorms, then improvising to those sounds. So that was Earth Sound. It still exists. And like I have it as, now I'm sharing some of these climate story music pieces through that platform. But if you do want to hear the music pieces, the best way is just to go to climatestoriesproject.org. And there's a climate music tab on there.
I noticed too on your website, Jason, that now you're encouraging other people. You've got a training for other people to collect climate stories. So do you want to tell us about how that sort of came about and what that's about?
Sure. It's a fairly new initiative called Climate Stories Ambassadors. That came about, I was working with a professor from Paul Smith's college, which is in the Adirondacks in upstate New York. And she had done something similar with some of her students, where during the summer, a couple students like traveled up and down the East Coast collecting climate stories. And she said, oh yeah, they're like ambassadors for climate stories. And I was like, oh, this is amazing. So they're still doing something similar, but it's not as specific towards climate change. So I thought I would just grow that ambassador project to be global. So far we've done 1 cohort. So like every 2 months, I'm hoping to do another cohort of ambassadors where people will find out about it on the website and sign up for a training and learn how to do these interviews and find people in their communities to interview about climate change. So yeah, it's been cool.
I love that because you and Rose have identified just sharing personal stories of people's experience. It takes it from the abstract, which climate change can feel so abstract and global, and how do you sort of help people connect with it? And that's what these stories are doing. I listened to the one from Clifford, who's part of the Member 2 First Nation in Nova Scotia, and he has a very powerful story, but also powerful because he's so connected to the land because of his Indigenous root. He kind of puts it in that context, and so it's so helpful for people to hear stories from all over the world because it's happening. We're experiencing the
exactly. Yeah, I would say everyone has a climate story. So like I've talked to like John Sinek or Clifford who have a generational connection with the landscape, and it's very, very powerful. So, I can't say that for myself. I grew up in Massachusetts, but like my family originally was from New York and then Eastern Europe. So it's a little bit different, but even just like anyone can connect with their environment. It doesn't have to be so profound. And as part of the training workshops we talked about objects of care. And an object of care is just something in your environment that you really connect with, and you feel how that's being threatened by climate change. So in my case, it's the seasons. You know, I really feel like that's my object of care, is the 4 New England seasons, and I really feel strongly that that's being affected by climate change, and it affects me personally. But it could be, you know, it could be your local agriculture, it could be a river you connect with, it could even be like your community or maybe even your family. So all those are objects of care, and we all have them. Sometimes we have to just dig a little bit to draw those to the surface.
Well, I remember I was part of Citizens Climate Lobby. I have been for years, and Mark Reynolds, the executive director, used to have these conversations. He'd often start with his personal story of the plum tree that he planted in his backyard in California, and how he planted it, because he has memories of, as a child, you know, climbing the plum trees in the neighborhood and stealing with his brothers, you know, plum trees, and this is the experience he wanted to have for his grandchildren. And now his plum tree isn't blossoming anymore, because he's found out from the nurseries around, it's not getting cold enough. I mean, again, it doesn't get cold
for the fruit to set,
for the tree to feel the cycle of the seasons, so it doesn't trigger even the blossoms.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yeah.
And I do think that we're all connected to, you know, what's home for us. Like, I was away from New England for a long time, for 30 years, but I felt drawn to come back, and it was particularly the seasons that I missed. I missed seeing the leaves change, and I missed that cold, crisp fall weather. And it's really, I've been back for 7 years. It's really not, it almost feels like, was that my childhood memory and it wasn't reality? It's completely different now.
Right. Yeah, we talk about that a lot with trainings, because, you know, at the end of the day, do we know what we're observing is climate change? And that's not a straight answer to that question, but I think we can just trust ourselves more than we believe we can. You know, we don't have to be scientific experts to believe that our reality is true. You know, our experience is true. But on the other hand, like, scientists are much more confident now than they say were 10 years ago about attributing extreme weather events or unusual temperatures or heat waves to climate change. So it used to be a scientist would say, no, we really can't be sure. You know, it's all statistical. But now, for a lot of these events, they can say, well, this would have been almost impossible without climate change.
Those 100-year events that are happening every 5 years or 2 years.
Exactly. Yeah. So, you know, the wildfires in California, like that would have been extremely, the severity of those, or the flooding in Houston, you know, a couple of years ago, those would have been very unlikely to be that severe without the impact of the changing climate. So yeah, we can trust ourselves. You know, we have, even young people who live in cities all over the world, you know, we have instincts that's accurate. So yeah, it's everyone has that capability.
So how many stories have you gathered so far?
Oh, geez, I kind of lost count. Well, I'd have to go count them. I haven't shared them all on the website too. I mean, probably, I would guess maybe like 3/4 of them are up, something like that. But yeah, it's been from people all over, a lot of people in Massachusetts. That's kind of where I got started with this. New York, a lot of from California, you know, a bunch from Canada.
Do people submit them on their own?
Sometimes I have like some prompts where people can write in responses to some of the questions I would ask, but then I would contact them to say, hey, do you want to record this? Or do you want to be interviewed? So that's how I've gotten some interviews from that. Or it's just been people I know, you know, or people, friends of friends, you know, who want to take part. Or sometimes I'll just be reading a news story and I'll be like, hey, this seems like a great person to reach out to. And a few years ago, I was reading the story about a tour guide leader in Reykjavik in Iceland who does glacier tourism. So he takes visitors out onto these glaciers and he talks, some of what they talk about is climate change. And he's observed, probably at this point, like the 5 years he's been doing it, just big changes in these ice caves, like how they've grown or shrunk, or there's open areas now where there wasn't. So, I just said, I really want to reach out to this guy. So I did it, and he did a great interview. It's been kind of all over the place how I've contacted people. This hasn't been one way. But I'm really excited about this ambassadors initiative because I want other people to do the interviewing, right? I don't want to be the
Yeah.
the person in charge of this, really. So I'm excited to help other people learn this, get this ability to reach out to people in their community. So I feel like the movement can really grow. The climate storytelling movement can grow from that approach.
So if our listeners were interested in joining that next cohort, when would that be?
I'm looking for January. So I'm going to talk to this woman, Kelly, that I'm working with, and we're going to plan out the best way to announce that. But yeah, I would definitely encourage your listeners to go to climatestoriesproject.org. We also have a mailing list. So if you want to sign up for the mailing list, as soon as the date is announced for the training, that'll be given out through the newsletter and on the website.
Sounds terrific.
So it sounds like you're also engaged with schools and communities in climate education.
Yeah, it's not something I'm doing full time, unfortunately, quite yet. But I teach at Worcester Polytechnic Institute in Worcester, Massachusetts. They have a global studies program where the students do these normally they'd be doing study abroad programs all over the world. And what I help them do is prepare the proposal they have to write to get the research. They do research projects. So it's like they're studying clean water or a museum education project. And the students I'm working with now I would be going to Australia. But now it's all online, so it's kind of weird.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's what I do, and then I teach music lessons as well. So
You're busy.
mix of things, but it's good. It's all rewarding stuff. So I'm really happy to be doing what I'm doing.
Thank you for your time. We usually close with talking about some good news, and so I think you had a few things that you wanted to say about what you see as good news for climate.
Sure, it's really difficult, right? The situation we're in is tough. We're not in a good place with the progress we should be making.
Not in the last 4 years, anyway. But
no. But even before that, I mean, it's like we've really been dragging our heels with this. But
yeah.
But I have been encouraged with some of the young people I've been interacting with through the trainings. I just did a climate storytelling training for Western Massachusetts Youth Climate Summit. And the kids were amazing. I mean, they were super passionate. They were really engaged with climate change.
How old are they?
They're high school students. So,
Okay.
when I was in high school, nobody was talking about climate change,
No.
or almost nobody.
No.
So it's great. I mean, they're very knowledgeable. They're passionate. They're fired up. And they had to, as part of the workshop, they had to plan out like an action for their school. And so some of them were doing, some solar energy projects or some recycling. But a couple of them actually wanted to do like climate storytelling. I was like, this is great. So
Yeah.
one of the teachers is working with a group of students who's like building this, kind of doing an ambassadors type program for their school. And I'm like, this is amazing. I mean, that's like a great way to spread the work around and get the kids involved. So that was really encouraging.
I love to see kids involved because I think it helps them. I mean, when they're passionate about it, they go back to their families and to their parents and get maybe people that are our age that are just not engaged yet.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think it's just become much more real for younger generations when they say, this is my future, and it's like, it's kind of being taken away from them. They had no responsibility, really, they're young. So they see the unfairness of it.
That is good news that the youth we can't leave them to do it all by themselves. And obviously all of us are engaged in working towards a livable future as well. That young people are doing it with passion and also a degree of optimism, because if they'd given up, they wouldn't be doing it. So I love that.
Right.
And how about an action tip?
I'm actually writing a blog post about this right now.
Oh.
So what does action mean, right? And sometimes we take a little bit of a limited view of what climate action can mean. Obviously we need to do things like ending our reliance on fossil fuels, which means boosting our use of renewable energy or driving electric cars or political advocacy. All those things are really important, but we need to also process what's going on inside ourselves. That's an action. We need to just be honest with ourselves, how we're feeling, and move forward with the place of being grounded in that reality. And also just talking with other people. If you have a conversation with your neighbor and you can actually talk about climate change and it's not just like this off limits topic, that's huge. That's how I encourage people to make an action, which it doesn't have to be sort of a typical climate change action.
I like that. Because, processing it is a lot.
Oh, yeah.
It seems like that's where the denial piece comes in. People don't want to look at it. They're just holding it in. They're not talking to anybody about it.
because it's so scary. And I guess sort of connecting the action tip that you just shared, Jason, to a sanity tip, that there may be actually some mental health benefit in sharing one's climate story.
Yeah, I believe there is. I don't think there's any hard evidence for that, but I know for myself, I feel empowered and I feel just more grounded, when I can talk about this and it's not something I'm locking inside or pretending is not an issue for me. And, and you connect with people. It's like you realize that you have something in common with people all over the world, people in Africa, people in Asia, people in Europe and North America, South America. It's like we all have these stories and it's just powerful to access them and feel some connection with people that we might not connect with otherwise.
Connecting at the heart level, it seems like makes it easier to take the next step forward. It's one thing to process it in your head. It's another thing to really address your feelings about what's happening.
Yeah, so we need that processing. I know like Joanna Macy inspired a lot of what I'm doing. That's really how her whole form of activism developed from. It is action. You need to engage your hands, but first you need to engage your heart. That's really what it comes down to. We do need action. We need to make positive change urgently, but that's going to come out of some deeper work as a culture we need to do more seriously.
What a wonderful conversation to have.
I just love your hopefulness. When you get into this subject, it can be very heavy and dense, but you seem to have found a way through that.
I hope so. Yeah. It's not easy for me, but I think I need to do this work. This is what I feel drawn to do. I'm not a protester. I'm not a political letter writer, but I feel this is something I can contribute and I feel connected to and good about.
Yeah. I think we all have our special talent.
Thank you for doing it because it is really important work. We're all in this for the long haul. Protesting and writing letters is good, but we need people doing exactly what you're doing. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thanks. No, we all do this together, right? Everyone has a contribution and there's no one right or wrong way to dig into this.
Great. Well, thanks for spending your time with us today.
Great. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks for having me.
That's this week's episode of Earth Feels. Special thanks to singer-songwriter Kristen Hoffman for generously allowing us to use Song for the Ocean. Thanks for listening.
Don't forget, subscribe to our podcast so you don't miss an episode. Catch you next time.
Bye-bye.
Children of the earth, I'm calling out. There's a mission for you and for me.